So here we are, talking about coaching and psychedelics. I'm here with an extra special guest today, Paul Austin, founder of the Third Wave, the first psychedelic microdosing coach. What was that? I think that was that article in the Rolling Stone, I think.
4
That was
years
the first
ago.
time. Yeah, that was the first time I
everyone's
Googled.
like, how can you do? I'm like, just wait. This will become a thing, more and more of a thing. A little early, but it's definitely a thing.
That was the days when I first explored coaching and psychedelics, and you just kind of Google, you put that into Google and this comes up. And at first I didn't put the name to the Third Wave. It was when I had a chat with Robin Card-Harris at a conference. And I said, I was just about to step out of academia, and I said, hey, how can I get involved in this? I'd love to apply some of this stuff. And he back then said, look into the Third Wave. And that's how I first heard about you guys. And since then, there's so much stuff that you brought out. You've done so much work, in the intersection of coaching and psychedelics. So I'm really excited to talk to you. We have a bit of time today. I don't like the kind of general stereotypical introduction. So we often ask here, like you're at a dinner party and somebody asks you, what do you do? What do you tell them?
More than anything, I consider myself a teacher. It's been the through line that's carried through careers, and coach is such coaching and teaching have a very interesting relationship. Coaching is much more about questions that open up a space, and teaching tends to be a little more prescriptive, I would say, than the coaching. Mm-hmm. But ever since I've been so young, curiosity and learning and reading and exploration has been central to my own development. And then even after undergrad, the first job that I held was as a English teacher in Turkey. I taught English as a second language for a year in Izmir, and then immediately after teaching for a year, not immediately after, but soon after, I moved to Thailand and launched my first business, which was ostensibly a coaching business around coaching students on how to become more proficient at spoken English in preparation for a standardized test. And then, I had some early psychedelic experiences when I was 19, 20 that were very influential at higher doses of psychedelics. And so when microdosing came on the scene in 2015, those two worlds naturally collided, the teaching and the coaching that I had built my first business around, with the sort of growing emergent interest in the intentional use of psychedelics. So, and ultimately that's where my path lies. I've chosen to become an entrepreneur and understand the business side of things, and how to create products and, sales and marketing and operational efficiencies and fundraising and all of those things I've become familiar with out of necessity. And where my true interest lies in all of this work is teaching and coaching. So even now internally with Third Wave, we have a phenomenal team in place where I'm finally, after being in the business operational for 4 or 5 years, finally have the ability to step out and really just hone in on, I would say, becoming a master at this intersection between psychedelics, coaching, and leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an exciting intersection. Before we get more into, putting a frame around coaching and why they make sense together, is there something else that you want to say to somebody that may not have heard of you, that gives you some relevant experience, relevant background, anything else that kind of made you who you are in this space?
The other core part of that story, I alluded a little bit to, working with psychedelics at the age of 19 and 20, how that was influential in pursuing a much more unconventional path. And the only reason I had the capacity, let's say, to do that is because I was raised with a lot of love and care from my parents. So fundamentally, I have, let's say, a very strong sense of attachment in a healthy way. A very strong felt sense of love, and that upbringing and sort of the safety and security, the internal safety and security that has come from that, has enabled sort of a felt sense of confidence to expand in ways that most people would not have felt comfortable with. So growing up, that meant, I was more sheltered and was raised quite religiously. There were very strong sort of containers around morality and what was good and what was bad. And it was through drugs like cannabis, LSD, and psilocybin that I came to learn what was useful from that and what could be let go of to allow further expansion and freedom. And then other fun, like facts and statistics. I've had the opportunity to travel to 60 countries. I've been fortunate enough to start 3 businesses, one of which I sold. And I've also been fortunate enough to be able to hang out in a space that even still today, with all the momentum around psychedelics, is still emergent and novel and not well understood. And I think that in itself is a fun space to exist within.
Yeah, I think we're both drawn to things that are new, where a lot of things are happening. We just talked a little bit before we started about positive psychology, and that was a very novel field by the time I got into it. It's also refreshing to hear, like almost refreshing, because so many of the stories in the coaching and psychedelics field are usually characterized by, I've had this very traumatic experience, or I went through this really difficult time. Psychedelics helped me to heal from a really challenging childhood. And so I think it's good to hear the voices that aren't coming from a kind of trauma background. And that's the kind of platform from which the psychedelic journey started. So it's good to hear that somebody's, coming from a relatively shielded upbringing and just looking at how do these substances work for growth and development.
Well, and that's an interesting even point of conversation is, what are the distinguishing factors between the therapeutic orientation and the coaching orientation, right? Because a lot of that healing then, and you're right, the majority of the folks who are coming to psychedelics still are coming at it because they've tried so many other things to deal with an abusive childhood, or to deal with, a traumatic experience, or to deal with, whatever else it might be, because nothing else has worked, and they find some sort of hope and optimism in them. And still, that's by and large a therapeutic orientation. If you're looking to sort of heal things from the past, when we look at coaching and psychedelics, we accept that things are the way that they are. We take radical responsibility for all the things that have happened to us without projecting blame, because projecting blame is a dispersion of power. And then by taking that radical responsibility, looking at reality as objectively as possible, we simply ask, what is it that I want to create? And how can a tool like psychedelics help with the manifestation of that? And I think that is so much more powerful for where we stand as a culture, as a society, as a global world, because a lot of what the current sort of mainstream narrative around psychedelics is around how to fix something, how to fix a problem, how to fix something that is broken. And Buckminster Fuller has a beautiful quote, which is, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's essentially, don't try to fix the old system, create a new system that makes the old system obsolete. And so I think challenge that I often embody the larger psychedelic space with is, what if there's nothing to fix? And instead, what if we use these tools to simply create a new way of being that helps us to evolve or transcend the current dilemmas that we are faced with? And I think that's what's most motivating, is if we look at how to shift things in a radical sort of lens of time. And what we learn from psychedelics is time is nonlinear, time can expand, time can contract. And so if we can play with time in such a way that allows us to catalyze systemic change, then I think it behooves the larger psychedelic space to evolve beyond the purely clinical approach as quick and as fast as possible. And that, more than anything, is what I've brought to the world through synthesis, through Third Wave, through the coaching program that we've rolled out, is again and again and again, I ask people to consider the greater possibility and not necessarily the fixing of the challenges and issues.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good distinction. And I'm a bit concerned about the number of coaches who use healing and coaching interchangeably. Coaching is such a large umbrella term, and arguably coaching can be quite therapeutic. But I see a worrying trend of coaches really focusing on helping people heal. And I think there's a lot of coaches out there who want to offer therapy, but they either don't want to train for 6-8 years, or they're just not legally allowed to call themselves that. And then they enter a space where arguably a lot of these coaches do amazing work. They really help people out. But it is risky, depending on, what it is you're dealing with, because a lot of the coaches just don't have the training or the knowledge to hold that space or offer appropriate interventions.
Well, and that's something that's interesting about psychedelics generally, is that the space that is opened up through an experience with, let's say, psilocybin, for example. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, when a person has that first experience with a psychedelic, it can be beautiful and enriching and cataclysmic in what in the insight that it brings, and it can often be very difficult because there's a lot of shadow or trauma that comes up the client wasn't aware of, and so then you simply have to ask, well, what is then the role of a coach when it comes to the psychedelics? And this is something that we've emphasized explicitly in our program, that the role of a coach is not the same as the role of a facilitator or the role of a guide. The role of a coach is also not the same as the role of a therapist or a psychiatrist. So if we look at coaching within the psychedelic space as simply preparation and integration, then we distinguish it from a guide or a facilitator who is there, who's present for the actual experience. Now, that doesn't mean a coach can't be there with the client during an experience. It simply means that the skill of coaching needs to be differentiated from the skill of guiding and facilitating, which also needs to be differentiated from certain therapeutic modalities that can help with trauma that might come up. And that's why I think, again and again and again, we emphasize this. It's so critical that if a coach wants to enter into this space and start to work with these medicines in a way that is helpful, it is essential for that coach to build a network of people who can support a coach with the clients that they're working with, because a coach isn't going to know what a psychiatrist will know, who might not know what a therapist will know, who might not be able to guide and facilitate the actual experience itself. Now, thankfully, because of all the education that is now coming out, Synthesis Institute, for example, they release an 18-month program to train clinicians in how to work with psilocybin in preparation for Oregon. CIIS has a program. Fluence has a program. It seems like every week there's a new program that's rolling out. Yeah. All of them, without exception, from what I've seen, all of them are focused on more the clinical applications, which is, again, why Third Wave re-rolled out the sort of creative orientation in coaching. And so I think that is good news, because prior to all of this education rolling out, a coach might feel as if, well, I would like to call on other people, but I don't know who to call on. I don't know who to build a referral network. And now there's no excuse. In other words, those people are becoming more accessible and available. Then what matters most for a coach is humility, and simply asking, what am I actually capable of? Where are my sweet spots? And what can I not do? And I need to refer out. Yeah. And that's, I think, central to the success of working with any client.
Yeah, and I think that's not different to any other coaching activity. You know, with any coaching client, you would need to ask yourself, how far am I willing and able to go? Am I willing and able to work with this client with what they're bringing? Every coach should have a team around them, or at least a referral network with some counselors, therapists, you know, some mindfulness meditation teachers, whatever your client might be bringing that you may not be willing or you may not be able to work with. Just you throw a psychedelic into the mix, and that becomes so crucially important that you have that kind of referral network. You know, somebody comes to you for integration coaching, and you know they open some really heavy doors into some spaces that are just not suitable for coaching, and then obviously you refer out. It's happening more often in coaching around psychedelics than it happens in coaching as usual, I guess.
Because so much of what's held in the subconscious or the unconscious is amplified and brought to the surface.
Exactly.
And I think that's why it behooves any professional or any individual who's working with psychedelics to actually go through these experiences themselves. You know, there's the old saying that, I think this applies to therapy, but the old saying that a therapist can only go to the depth to which they have gone themselves for a client. Mm-hmm. And even the absurdity of some of the conversations currently going on in the psychedelic space around therapists on clinical trials who have never done psychedelics, which is asking for trouble in many, many ways. And so I was working recently with a client myself who's considering her own path at the intersection of psychedelics and neuroscience, positive psychology, psychedelics. And even what we landed on was to do a program that might not be psychedelic oriented, like a positive psychology master's program, for example, the one at UPenn that we were talking about, and to balance that with one's own individual work with these substances. So then when we look to the training that a coach should go through, so much of it is the actual experience itself. It's the lived experience. It's working with MDMA, it's working with psilocybin, it's working with ayahuasca, it's working with microdosing, it's working with higher doses, it's understanding other modalities that open up an altered state of consciousness, whether that's breath work, meditation, cold plunges, neurofeedback. So then the model that we've been developing and looking into is this concept of psychedelic use as a skill. So in other words, if a coach is going to work with clients in a way that is beneficial, then they really need to do the work themselves. So having a clear sense of how MDMA affects them, how psilocybin affects them, what's the role of ayahuasca, what's the role of microdosing versus higher doses, how do supporting modalities like breathwork, meditation, yoga, cold plunge, neurofeedback, how do those play a role in a client's path to healing and transformation? Also diet, exercise, sleep. You know, so many clients, particularly in the psychedelic space, will present as having certain challenges or problems, and simply dialing in their sleep quality, their diet, their exercise addresses a lot of those challenges and issues. And so I think it's incumbent for any coach who's working in the psychedelic space to always look at things from a holistic perspective. Mm-hmm. Physically, physiologically, are you taking care of yourself? What are your practices? Are you well? Are you healthy? Emotionally, are you taking care of yourself? Are you healthy? Are you well? Are you centered? Are you grounded? Do you have your own practices that continue to bring you into a state of well-being? We could also talk about, spiritually. Is there a sense of connection to something that's greater than you? So all of those frameworks are useful to understand as a psychedelic coach, again, because through psychedelics, we learn that there is no boundary, that everything is connected. And so if that's the case, then and I see this especially true in, let's say, the psychedelic community, there needs to be a much greater emphasis put on the things that happen outside of the talk therapy and even the taking of psychedelics. Mm-hmm. I think that's central to helping any client with this work. Yeah.
Can I challenge you on that? Because I generally agree that it helps enormously to know what these substances do with your mind. we don't really apply the same for, let's say, a therapist who works with psychosis or bereavement. It might make them better therapists if they had a psychotic episode themselves, or if they've been living with depression themselves. But, phenomenologically, when they hold space for somebody, everybody's experience is very different. It affects, there's certain parallels, of course, there's certain themes in how it affects people, how it affects the brain. But everybody's trip, depending on the substance, is bound to be quite different. So in some respects, I think, yes, absolutely, it helps enormously to know what's going on there and how it feels. But phenomenologically, I think we make a lot of assumptions when we go through our own journeys, and then somebody else has their journey and they come in and they tell us about their journey. I think it's risky to say, I understand how you've experienced that because I've experienced that. So I always put that out there, because one of the most common themes that I've picked up from the podcast, from talking to people so far, is you have to have had your own experiences. And I'm trying to figure out to what extent it's useful and at what point might it actually be in the way.
Well, I would ask a question back to you then. Let's say you were a client and you were new to psychedelics and never done them before, and you were interested in starting down that path. Would you choose a coach who has studied it academically but has never actually had the experience themselves, or someone who has never studied it academically but has gone through several experiences? And so I think that's a good consideration, because there's this concept called skin in the game that I think is relevant to this topic, which is subconsciously we trust people who have been where we want to go. And I think that's especially true for coaching. And so if a coach is of high integrity, if you're choosing to work with them, if they come through a referral, the central thing to that relationship is trust, particularly if you're working with psychedelics, because of how much trust it requires. And for anyone who has done MDMA or worked with psilocybin or gone to an ayahuasca retreat, the amount of time and energy that they themselves have spent on researching prep and integration, on researching what makes a good retreat versus a not so good retreat, on researching, neurologically what's going on with psilocybin versus ayahuasca. I would imagine any coach worth their salt, if they've done this work themselves, has become familiar with that terrain, so to say. And the point that you make around my experience is different from your experience is fundamentally true. I think that's important to emphasize. And the experience that psychedelics open up is just so much different than any, normal waking state of consciousness. We can even look at, Freudian psychology versus Jungian psychology. If I was working with a therapist or a coach who had never done psychedelics before, I would much rather have them be familiar with sort of Jungian psychology and depth therapy and because there's more overlap with psychedelics versus a purely Freudian approach, which is coming at things from a CBT lens, so to say. So I think that's also another consideration is typically if you have a coach or a therapist who has done psychedelics, then they will be very familiar with, an orientation that is much more around depth and seeing the self as not just a mind, a brain, but as something that is connected to something much broader and greater than what we are.
Yeah, and the big difference is that a therapist cannot choose to go get depressed or go get bereaved or go have a psychotic episode, but we can choose to do the work with psychedelics and experience a wide range of altered states and how we might prepare and integrate them.
Precisely.
Right. So, I want to take it back to the coaching bit. How did you get into coaching? Where did you train? Like, I know you're coming from the kind of teaching angle into it, but I wonder what you have done to prepare for the coaching part of the journey.
So growing up, my formal training is very little, almost non-existent. I've never done a certification. I've yet to attend any sort of, I've done workshops here and there, but nothing significant. I was a collegiate athlete in the States in soccer. So, and did my own,
football.
I coached football, coached and trained teams as part of that. I've always loved to learn, love to ask questions, have always been very curious. Upon graduation, like I said, moved to Turkey, taught English there for a year. And then simply the first business that I launched was a coaching business. And so I built that into a reasonably sized business just because of the efficacy of how I was helping clients prepare and kind of nail this experience.
So this was straight into psychedelics then, the coaching business?
No. The first business that I did was to prepare students for the TOEFL test, test of English as a foreign language.
Gotcha.
So this is a standardized test that non-native speakers have to pass in order to get their MBA at Harvard, in order to become a full-fledged pharmacist, in order to get a job as a teacher in the United States. So you have
or go to high school in the US. I've been there.
Go to high school, right? There's various levels. The clients that I worked with were largely pharmacists, teachers, medical doctors, and MBA students. And they needed to pass this and become more proficient at speaking for this test to be able to pass it. So I would train them not only on sort of the explicit skill of grammar and how to speak English better, but much more so on the soft skills of confidence and preparation and learning and overall fluency and things like that. And so essentially then throughout my 20s, I just continued to learn and learn and learn. I was sort of a personal development junkie in that way. And that sort of naturally then led to microdosing and microdosing coaching. So in 2015, I started microdosing myself with LSD twice a week for 7 months with two intentions. One was to help with flow for the creative projects that I was working on. And the other one was to essentially mitigate social anxiety. So instead of using alcohol, to use microdoses of LSD largely when going out and socializing and connecting with others. And I had my own experiences with them, with microdosing for about a year. And then after that, I wrote a book on microdosing. And then soon after that, started doing public talks on microdosing. And then, about mid 2017, about 2 years after I started microdosing, started offering consultations and kind of one-off coaching calls as it related to microdosing. So
how does the coaching element come into it? Because there seems to be a large kind of teaching, training, educating element to that. On the other side, we have the kind of holding space, facilitating, somebody finding their own answers. You seem to be bringing those together. I wonder what the kind of balance is for you.
Between teaching and facilitation. So in large part, that just depends on the set and setting and the context, right? So in larger groups, it's much more around teaching, I would say, right? There's a transmission of information that has to occur.
Yeah.
And then through that teaching, there's also facilitation in small groups. There's if we're using Zoom, there's facilitation in breakout rooms, as part of even what we're doing for CCP. Friday is a lecture, Wednesday are integration sessions, and Tuesday are basically a combination of both of those.
Yeah.
So I think there's really no boundary between teaching and coaching.
Yeah.
If you're coming at things from a purely coaching methodology, then it's almost explicitly questions and questions and questions. You're looking at how you can guide the client into knowing the answers for themselves, so to say. And I always find that any engagement is not purely questions. There's also an element of advising or teaching or direction within that as well. So just depending on the client, what their needs are, where they're at, that, it's always a balance of great questions and appropriate advice or resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. Could you talk us through some of the, I know there isn't a typical the coaching journey, but maybe you can tell us about 2 or 3 kind of case studies and how that went from what people came in with, what were the kind of skills that you employed? Is there a process that you follow? And could you tell us a little bit about how the coaching journey is like for you?
As the coach or the client?
You coaching clients, but could also be you having worked with a coach, as long as we dive into the kind of practical element of it.
Well, and I always make a joke that with coaching, it's sort of what I would say, turtles all the way down, so to say,
Turtles all the way down?
Turtles all the way down, meaning I'm a coach and I have a coach, and my coach has a coach, and probably her coach has a coach. And obviously as
hopefully.
a coach, I have clients who have clients, right? So there's always a range of that. And, I'll provide a little bit of context and background first before I go into some of the specifics. So I had, as a college athlete, I had coaches. Growing up, I had plenty of coaches. In school, the professors that you have are coaching you to some degree. But in my professional space, I only had mentors and not an actual coach. And I had some great mentors, but not coaches who were there consistently helping to unplug certain things. I was my own coach for many years. And then just before COVID hit about 1.5 years ago, we had reached just a point with third wave and a point in my own personal work that I recognized sort of the necessity to bring on a one-on-one coach who could really help to unstick certain areas that I was struggling with and help me to become a better leader for third wave as an organization. So I brought in a coach and we worked together one-on-one for 3 or 4 months. That coach was very similar to me. So what he came in with was a lot of structure in terms of daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly reviews and how to implement those, habit tracking and a habit spreadsheet in terms of how to be mindful of behavioral change and what were habits that I wanted to continue to build and grow on. And then simply in the one-on-one calls, when we would show up, asking phenomenal questions to guide me into a deeper understanding of where I wanted to go and who I was. And he was a very good coach in that he largely asked questions and then came with a few resources external to it, like a habit tracking spreadsheet, the review stuff. We also implemented something that was like a calendar function where I had to track all of my time on a calendar on a day-to-day basis. Right. Mm-hmm. And then we reached a point in our coaching relationship, probably about 4 months in, where he recognized that I needed a coach that was going to challenge me a little bit more and help me grow a little bit more. So I brought in someone else who was, about 15 years older than me, who was a woman who, compared to my initial coach, who was very structured, she is an intuitive. She has her doctorate in Chinese medicine. She's an acupuncturist. Her coaching style is extremely intuitive. There's no structure outside of it. It's simply we show up and she's helping me to align to my own intuition and to listen to it and understand it, to minimize self-sabotage, and then to take that feeling and use that feeling from a leadership perspective to align everything that needs to align.
Right.
And the reason I'm communicating this is because since I had done so much of my early work alone, I would say, without a proper coach, the first coaching, one-on-one intensive coaching that I went into has been very influential then in how I've constructed my own coaching frameworks and what has been brought into, for example, Third Wave's coaching program. Mm-hmm. And so what I always try to balance then is the rational with the mysterious, or the sort of structure with sort of the emergent space, right? Mm-hmm. How do we both, when we're working with a client, bring in foundational elements that help the client to feel supported, while ensuring that they recognize that this is largely an emergent process and that any coaching container is customized and personalized for what they need. And that means what they need at that moment in time. And that changes throughout the coaching protocol and the coaching period.
Yeah.
So much of my own coaching process then is simply showing up with every arrangement, and asking, where is it that you're at? What has shifted since we've last met? And where do you need guidance to go from this point in time? Now, when I have, for example, the one-on-one coaching arrangements that I do, I look at working with a client usually for 6 months. So I'm looking at a 6-month arrangement, and within that framework and within that time, helping them to integrate what I call the skill of psychedelic use, which I alluded to earlier. Mm-hmm. And that skill, I would say, is broken up into a few matrices. One is the type of medicine that they're using. The second is the amount of the medicine that they're using. And the third is the frequency of that medicine that they're using. So specific to psychedelics, the medicine, MDMA versus psilocybin versus ayahuasca, the amount, usually a microdose versus what I would call a museum dose versus a macro dose, and how we're calibrating in between those levels. And then the frequency is for a high dose journey that might be once every 3 months, for microdosing that could be 3 or 4 times a week, for a museum dose as sort of a prophylactic in between microdoses and high doses that could be once a month or once every 2 weeks, right? So I'm first helping them develop sort of an intuitive understanding of the medicine that they need and what's appropriate for when. And almost always the clients that I work with are fairly new to psychedelics. And so then when I'm working with a client, I'm looking at implementing this analogy of the lotus flower. And have you heard about the lotus flower analogy?
Tell us.
Oh, it's a beautiful analogy. I think you'll really enjoy it. So the lotus flower analogy, and I did not create this myself. This is from a woman named Ann Other, who wrote a book on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy called Trust, Surrender, Receive. And she published it in 2017 about all of her underground work with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And what she teaches her clients is this lotus flower metaphor when you're working with psychedelic medicines. And that is, before you can have sort of the transcendent experience with like a 5-MeO DMT, which is unfortunately what many clients jump right into, which I think is very risky and would strongly advise against, is first one needs to till the soil, right, of the transformation. So till the soil of the transformation. And typically that's best done with something like MDMA, because MDMA is, at this point in time, likely the best medicine that is available to deal with trauma. And so before we start planning a new seat of self, we need to make sure that we've healed any significant trauma that's sort of hanging out in the unconscious or subconscious. So MDMA allows us to till that soil. Ketamine can also help with tilling that soil as a legal, currently available framework and treatment for it.
Yeah, I think just to throw that in, I think generally seeing a coach or doing your work or seeing a therapist, even without substances, is already tilling the soil. So
doing float tanks, or doing breath work, or starting a meditation practice, right? All of these can be phenomenal ways to start to dive into the shadow and bring out things that have been stuffed away for many, many years. So I think that's absolutely true. And so that first step is tilling the soil. The second step is planning the new seat of self, which is what something like psilocybin or LSD is ideal for, the classic psychedelics, because this classic psychedelics often engender something called ego dissolution. And so when we dissolve the ego completely, what we recognize is this truth of interconnectedness, that we are interconnected to everything around us, and that our sense of well-being is intimately tied to the well-being of our community, our family, our friends, our environment. It's also intimately tied to the behaviors and the patterns that we ourselves hold, the food that we eat, the way that we sleep, the exercise, et cetera, et cetera. So when we plant that new seed of self, that's the psilocybin or LSD. And then the practices of integration, whether that's meditation, breath work, journaling, microdosing, float tanks, therapy, whatever it is, the integration is the water that we use to fertilize that new seed, right? And that's what helps that new seed to grow and develop. And it could very well be that we need another high dose experience in there with psilocybin, but we're continuing to grow that new sense of self. And then once we've invested the time and energy to grow that new sense of self, then we have an opportunity to really open up the lotus flower. And that's what the plant medicines can help with. The ayahuasca, the San Pedro, the peyote, the 5-MeO-DMT is once you've cultivated and tilled the soil, planted that new seed of self, it's started to grow. Then you're looking for that blossoming of that incredible peak experience. And that's when these deeper plant medicines can often be beneficial. So that's generally the trajectory that I honor with the clients that I work with. And of course, 6 months is almost never enough time to get to that lotus flower blossoming. Usually we'll work on tilling the soil and start to plant that new seed of self. But oftentimes a client, this is a path that they're starting and that they'll now continue on for many times for the rest of their lives. And so ensuring that really solid foundation is in place is usually the role that I've played with clients so far.
So I'm assuming that in the beginning, or when somebody reaches out to you to do that kind of work, you would tell them about either that kind of metaphor or in some way kind of get an assessment of where that person is at in their journey. Is there anything else that you do to screen people, either to figure out where to start or what kind of regime they might go into, what kind of medicines to work with, how often and how much, as you said in your kind of 3 levels? Anything else that you include in the beginning in that confirmation, or is there any questionnaire? What's your process for feeling the right client out and then figuring out how to work with them?
So I always have an application that they first read. So if a client reaches out and is interested in potentially, engaging in a coaching relationship, well, first I'll have them set up a call, because I'll usually do a little due diligence. Set up a call, maybe 20 minutes just to touch base. I'll then ask them to fill out an application form and read through a blog post that explicitly describes this lotus flower metaphor. So they have a clear sense of it. Then once I've reviewed the application form, I almost always have a sense of their background. I have a sense of their intentions, their goals with the coaching arrangement. I ask questions in there also if they're on, any psychiatric medications, if they have a history of trauma, if there's, anything else that I need to be aware of, because almost always I will screen those people out if they have things like that. And then on the very first coaching call, if they pass that initial screening, and obviously we've come to an engagement that works for both of us, on that first coaching call, I typically will ask the client, usually I do coaching calls anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. And I'll ask the client to tell me their life story. And I'll say, start where you want, end where you want. Tell me all the details that feel appropriate. And if they're a little short, and they're not opening up as much, then I'll prod and I'll poke and sort of open up certain spaces and areas that I think need to be fleshed out a little bit more. But most of the time, the clients are very forthright and just willing to sort of divulge, hey, like this is what I've gone through. This is where I'm at. This is sort of my history. I think relationship to parents is critical to understand and establish, because that will often play a role in any coaching arrangement and relationship. Any traumatic experiences, any sort of things that have been difficult or challenging. But again, so much of coaching is around the creative orientation. So once I have a sense of that, and almost always the clients who are coming to me, although they might be new with psychedelics, they've often done a lot of other inner work. So they've almost always seen a therapist before. They usually have some sort of practice, maybe around meditation or breath work or yoga or whatever it is. And now they really want to amplify their experience with it. So once we land on these are the objectives, these are the intentions, I have a clear sense of your background and where that it is you're going. Then I usually have clients read 2 books as part of a coaching arrangement. The first book informs the first 3 months of us working together. And the second book informs the last 3 months of us working together. And those books might slightly shift and change depending on the client orientation, but it's almost always that I'll have them read those. And then throughout our coaching, I'll just fill in with other resources or chapters or podcasts or whatever.
What are the books, if you don't mind sharing?
So this is the secret sauce, which I rarely divulge, but I will do so on the podcast. The books that I've found to be most useful at this point in time, the first one is called Letting Go by David Hawkins. And the second book is the book I mentioned before we went live. It's called The Path of Least Resistance by Robert Fritz. And letting go is largely about the process of letting go of negative emotions. And so that's often what I'll bring clients through at least the first month, if not 2 months, if not 3 months, is how do we let go of shame, anger, guilt, even things like desire. And then the path of least resistance is about establishing a clear sense of creative orientation. And so the core thing that Fritz talks about in the path of least resistance is what he calls structural tension. And essentially, how do we establish objective reality? How do we establish what it is that we want to create, what it is that we're choosing to create, and visualize that as clear and strong as possible? And then how do we create a structure that allows us to hold the tension between where we're at now and what it is that we want to create with our existence? And I find that to be a very powerful model and framework for students, particularly when we work with psychedelic substances, because it's often what comes up intuitively with psychedelics anyway. And so if there's a way to put a structure and framework around that allows us to actually get very specific about the different steps along the way in that process, then it's supremely helpful for this type of work.
Fantastic. And thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. So it is quite a curated, guided kind of journey. So there's, there is a structure involved that is relatively loose. So, the client can still come in with whatever is on their mind. But there is guidance through that journey that can lead the way in some ways.
Well, and there has to be, because when you're working with psychedelic medicines, the person, in particular psychedelic medicines, the person who you're meeting with will not be the same person who you're 2 months in, 4 months in, 6 months in, right? That is the promise with working with psychedelic medicines, is the way in which they enable and accelerate behavioral change. Because of what they're doing neurobiologically, because of what they're doing from an emotional perspective, because of sort of the trust and openness and surrender that they engender for clients. So it is so critical for any coach in this space to be able to let go of any preconceived notions and have the presence to always show up in that moment with a client and address things where they're at in that point of time. I think that's key.
Yeah. I'd love to get a little bit into, I guess it's about your program as well, because the question that we often ask is, what does a coach need to know in order to get into this kind of work? You mentioned already, having your own experiences, like getting a bit of a sense for what these states are like. What else do you think a coach needs? And I guess this is what you're training or what you're offering on your program.
So to root that a little bit more, not only the experience that a person has with it, but even beyond that, what I would say is cultivating the skill of psychedelics, right? And that's done both, what I would say, through personal experiences, through mentorship itself, and then through learning, through books, through podcasts, through some of that more cognitive understanding. The balance of those three, I think, is enough as a starting point to look at, okay, now I want to become a coach in the psychedelic space. What else do I need? So first of all, the skill of psychedelics. Second of all, then the skill of coaching, we could say.
In that order, is that important, do you think?
Not necessarily, because I think so many coaches who are already established coaches hear about psychedelics and want to integrate it into their practice, right? So it's an either or. Oftentimes those who have these awakening experience with psychedelics sort of have this impetus to, well, this was so meaningful. Now, how do I make this part of my professional life? Oh, I can be a coach or a guide. Good. What do I need to become a coach or a guide then? But it can also happen the reverse. I'm a coach. I hear about psychedelics. How do I get involved in this work? How do I develop the skill of psychedelics? So I think those are the two fundamental things: the skill of psychedelics and the skill of coaching itself. And then what we do with our program is we weave those two together, right? We assume a certain level of competency already when it comes to coaching. So, we ask that people, if they're enrolling in our coaching certification program, that they already have an established coaching practice, or they do coaching in some ways. And what that means is we have some folks who are, for example, in corporations, working in corporations, who don't necessarily have freelance coaching clients, but they do a lot of coaching internally to their team to help guide them and support them and inspire them. Right.
Makes sense.
So, and then our program is saying, look, it's a 3-month program. It's a 3-month intensive. There's not enough time in a 3-month intensive to both cover the fundamentals of coaching and the fundamentals of psychedelics when applied to coaching. So we are going to assume a certain level of competency when it comes to coaching itself. And we are going to hone in and focus in on how do you integrate psychedelics into your coaching practice. And so some example, modules that we have is like we start off the first week with sort of context around psychedelics themselves. The first wave of psychedelics, the second wave of psychedelics, the third wave of psychedelics, what has brought us to this point in time. So it's a lot around the history and the context and the ethics as it relates to psychedelics. Another one of our modules goes through the different medicines that we're using. I integrate the lotus, flower metaphor, hone into the skill of psychedelics. The most recent one that I taught was around integration, which is generally what is integration? What's the difference between frameworks, protocols, and modalities when it comes to an integration framework? What's the difference between a framework, that's focused on healing versus a framework that's focused on the creative orientation? In future modules, we'll talk about frameworks for leadership. How do psychedelics help inspire new models of leadership? What are those new models of leadership? Because many of the coaches who come into our program are executive coaches. So they're looking to weave this into the work that they're doing with corporate clients or startup clients or whatever it is. Another module is around wellness. Diet, sleep, exercise. How do you help clients to dial those things in? What are the assessments that you can carry out to see where they're lacking and what needs to be improved? So really, again, looking at things from a holistic perspective. And then most importantly, as part of that 3-month intensive, we also have a retreat. So we do a 4-day retreat where all the coaches come in. We have a chance to connect and go through our own ceremony ourselves to actually go through this work and to see what that's like. We also have integration sessions. So we meet, we do breath work together, we do sound healing together, we do small group kind of breakout rooms to integrate some of the knowledge that's been taken on during the prior week. And we also have faculty workshops. So we bring in incredible guest faculty who teach 2-hour workshops on, again, the range of topics from, we had Dave Rabin. Dave is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who founded the Apollo Neuro. He came in and did a faculty workshop on the neuroscience of psychedelics. We have Keith Ferrazzi, who's a leadership coach. He wrote a book called Never Eat Alone. He is a faculty in teaching about co-elevation and the role of psychedelics. We have Ben Greenfield, who's sort of a biohacker extraordinaire, who's teaching a faculty workshop on optimizing, physical well-being. So we've really done our best to overload the coaches. You're right. We want it to be too much. We don't want them to feel like we want them to feel really pulled into something that's much beyond what they were previously capable of, while still ensuring that the structure is there, so that way they feel supported and held as they're moving through this process of transformation themselves. Because as so many of us know, through this work, there is no boundary between the personal and the professional. And so really challenging these coaches to adapt and to learn is, I think, central to the program itself. So that way they come out of it both with the sort of cognitive understanding, but more important, the experiential sort of knowledge and understanding of what this guidance can do for their own well-being, and then the way that they relate to their clients.
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems from the way that you talk about it, especially your coaching journeys, and also like my experience with a lot of that work, a huge part of this is just coaching. The coaching somebody who's doing whatever and coaching somebody who's going through a psychedelic journey or coming back from a psychedelic journey, particularly the integration one, seems to be, there's a huge overlap. So I wonder if you could talk about where you see the work with psychedelics being particularly different compared to coaching somebody who's, integrating some other sort of experience, whatever that may be. So I'm wondering what is the thing about coaching around psychedelics, either in preparation, obviously there's a lot, but particularly around the integration journey.
So your question is around, with psychedelics as the core variable, how does that change our approach to coaching and a coaching methodology?
That's right? It. Perfect rephrase.
So I think one thing in particular to state up front is that although psychedelics are of a single variable, what we teach is that, in fact, ayahuasca is different than MDMA, is different than psilocybin, and microdosing LSD is going to be different than macrodosing LSD. Microdosing psilocybin is going to be different than macrodosing psilocybin. So a lot of what we teach to then is, okay, if we go back to this matrices, if you will, of macrodose versus microdose, MDMA versus psilocybin versus ayahuasca, supporting modalities like breathwork, yoga, meditation, neurofeedback. What is that ideal framework that you can bring to a client based on their needs, based on how you can best support them? So I think one of the core things to focus on is that this isn't just psychedelic medicine as a single variable. This is psychedelic medicine with dozens of variables based on the medicine and the amount and the frequency. Right.
So how do you make those decisions? Is that something that you bring in as a coach and, there's recommendations based on experience, based on knowledge, or how do you come up with how often, which medicine, and what kind of frequency?
I think that, so it's really interesting that you're bringing that up, because in our last module, which was a module that focused on integration, part of the homework is for coaches to create their own framework. So what I mean by that is Françoise Borzat, who wrote a book called Consciousness Medicine. She has a framework in that book, which talks about body, mind, spirit, community, environment. Right. And if a client is presenting and needing to do, they have something somatic, there's something physical that they need to be addressed, that'll come up, and you'll prepare them and you'll help them integrate that as part of the experience. If it's something spiritual, then you can identify that and understand that. And then when it comes to Fritz, right, Fritz has his own framework for the path of least resistance. And his framework is objective reality is here. What I want, what I choose to create is here. And the structure I'm putting into place comes with primary fundamental choices, primary choices, and secondary choices, right? And so what we're essentially teaching coaches is, it is your responsibility. We're providing the framework or the overall sort of landscape. We have them read Consciousness Medicine as part of the training. We have them read Fritz's book. We have them review a lot of resources and podcasts. And ultimately, we're saying to them, okay, now based on the understanding that you've come to throughout this entire intensive, what framework are you going to bring to your clients, integrating what you've just learned in this 3-month program with what your skill set already is, right? And that's going to be different for an executive coach compared to a life coach, compared to a healer, compared to a wellness coach or a movement coach, right? Each one of those coaches is going to have their own framework that they work with clients in. And so then how do they determine what medicine is appropriate when? I think that comes down to intuition. That comes down to having a clear understanding of where the client is at in their journey and what's most appropriate for them. And also understanding that it's better to err on the side of caution. especially if you're working with a client who's new to these substances and to these medicines. And so again, I go back to the lotus flower analogy, right? Till the soil. Another metaphor that I use is before we can jump in the deep end and do, cartwheels and flips and all the fun things in the deep end of the swimming pool, we first have to learn to swim in the shallow end. Before you can explore the caverns of your consciousness, you first have to learn what it means to come to stillness and quiet and sort of a sense of equanimity, right? And so that's why we teach this entire framework, so that they go, okay, I need to slowly open a client up more and more and more, and then support them as they're growing into that new sense of self with the help of the framework that we learned from Paul or from Third Wave or from Francois or from Fritz or from whatever it is. So how I see that growing and evolving in the future in terms of how we support coaches is basically small group supervision. So we have a 3-month intensive where we go really deep. It's 6 to 7 to 8 hours a week of work. We have the retreat as part of that. But then popping out the other side, we're asking, how do we support coaches on an ongoing basis with either monthly or bi-monthly small group supervision, so they can come to those small groups with challenges or problems that are coming up with the clients that they're working with, and have support and guidance in how to navigate those with the help of psychedelic medicines. Because it's one thing to complete a program and go through an intensive, but again, if these medicines are as powerful as we know they are, and if the rate of change is as rapid as we know it is, then coaches, along with clients, coaches need support on an ongoing basis to ensure that their clients feel held and can continue to grow into sort of a full flourishing of self, if you will.
Yeah, 100%. I'm working hard to put supervision as a crucial pillar of any coach's work who works in this space.
Well, I think this goes back to what we were talking about before, which is this really is an emergent space. Not only coaching and psychedelics, but I would also argue coaching generally, because when you become a therapist, when you become a psychiatrist, there's a lot more. There's licensure, there's supervision, there's a lot of oversight. It's still pretty much the Wild West when it comes to coaching, because the framework that we're bringing doesn't fit within the let's fix what's broken model, which is predominantly what most life exists within. Instead, it's asking, what is it that we want to create? And that's just not as common these days. So it's almost, and I think that is also the opportunity that psychedelics, coaching, and the creative orientation present, is how do we ensure that from the get-go, there are rigorous structures in place for ethics and safety and accountability, and even the quality of coaches, right? This is why even at Third Wave, this is A, why we're training coaches, and B, why we've rolled out a directory of retreats and clinics and therapists and coaches, because there's a lot of stuff coming onto the scene as it relates to psychedelics. There's new retreats popping up all over the place. There's new therapists who are coming out into the world. There's new coaches. And it's one thing to say publicly that, oh, I'm a shaman, or oh, I'm a healer, or oh, I'm a therapist, or oh, I can coach psychedelics. It's another thing to actually have the competency and the ability to do that. And I think this is so crucial to the success of this movement, because what is likely to happen is that decriminalization and state-by-state legalization will outpace FDA medicalization. And if that's the case, and I believe it will be the case, FDA medicalization, clinical licensure, there's already a lot of rigorous and rigid structure in place to ensure that things don't get too wonky, to ensure that there's significant oversight from an ethics perspective. There's really not that when it comes to decrim and, particularly decrim, also a little bit of the state-by-state legalization, although I know the Oregon health state authorities are putting that into place. But it's the Wild West right now. Anyone can call themselves a shaman. Anyone can call themselves a coach. And so how do we self-regulate and ensure that we only amplify trustworthy, ethical providers who are really going to hold an incredible space for this experience. And I think that more than anything is central to the success of this, or else we very well could see a repeat of, the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and here we are in the middle of our quickfire questions already. We have a couple of questions that we ask every guest at the end, and I think you tapped in about 3 of those already right now. We talked about regulation and, self-regulating. Do we need a regulating body in coaching and psychedelics? What do you think? Do we need more of it, or is it holding good people back from practicing?
I think you absolutely need some level of regulation, some level of credentialism, some level of training, so that the wider public has a clear sense of quality and has a clear sense of who to trust. Mm-hmm. I don't think that necessarily should come from a central government body. I think it's much better to come from a third party. Mm-hmm. But you absolutely need to have some level of regulation, especially for psychedelic medicine, because it's so volcanic.
I mean, you're a good example of this, because you've not done any formal coaching training, but you're doing really powerful work with clients. If a professional body would come in, or some regulating body, and would say, hey, you got to be ICF accredited, you got to be AC accredited, or you got to have this or that amount of coaching hours, that would hold somebody back from doing really good practice. It's super difficult where to draw the lines, right?
It is, because I look at things from like a broader perspective, and you're right, on an individual perspective, there are certainly exceptions to that. So I'm sure there's a world in which you can meet both of those. If someone already has a lot of real world experience that they can point to, and there's an assessment that they can undergo to ensure that, yes, in fact, I don't need to go through a full 6-month certification program to do this. I think you can have a world where that exists, and where you still have a certification. That's
the kind of portfolio route. Even in the ICF, they have a portfolio route. If you haven't done the ICF accredited training, you can say, I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this. And then somebody looks at it and says, yes, you can have our stamp of approval. There's a question around, authority, and especially in the psychedelic community, the relationship to authority, and who might that be? I guess we're going to continue talking about it. Next one I've got here. You've already mentioned a few good books that you recommend. Are there any other books or people that you would, or podcasts, or any resources that you would recommend to a coach in this space?
There's so many that I almost have a hard time landing on the ideal few. I think Consciousness Medicine, Psychedelic Explorer's Guide by Jim Fadiman, Letting Go by David Hawkins, The Path of Least Resistance by Robert Fritz, The Little Book on the Human Shadow by Robert Bly, which is a good one. I'll land there. There's probably 5 or 10 more, but I don't want to take up too much time in the quickfire.
Fair play. If somebody asks you about the difference between coaching and therapy, what do you tell them? I know you kind of touched on that already a little bit at the beginning, but is there a sentence, or is there a short version of how you would explain the difference to someone?
I've always seen the therapeutic orientation as an orientation towards the past and towards healing the past. So to bring things up from the subconscious and the unconscious that need to be healed, trauma, abuse, a lack of attachment, healthy attachment, whatever it is. That seems to me to be the focus. Relationship to your parents, boundaries for that reason. Whereas coaching is simply asking, what is it that you want to create with your lives, and how can I support you to step into that larger vision of what it is that you want to create? Again, it's much more of a creative orientation rather than a healing or addressing what's wrong orientation.
Yeah, I like the terminology used, the creative orientation. I think that that hits something on the head. Any notable current or future trends you see in the coaching and psychedelic space? I know you've touched on a few already, but I wonder if there's something that coaches out there should be aware of.
Well, a few threads. One, if decrim, it continues at the pace at which I think it will continue. Two, there's more and more awareness from a leadership perspective about the utility of psychedelics to help with communication, vision, teamwork, empathy. And three, we're faced with an existential crisis that we've never been faced with before. How do we leverage these openings to integrate psychedelics into leadership frameworks to shift business from being incentivized by status, ego, and more to being incentivized by connection, mission, creation, and sustainable regenerative work. I think that to me is the big kind of nut to crack, if you will, is and then of course the tricky part is how do you navigate that from an HR perspective? And that is a tricky part. And it's funny, one of my mentors in this space, when I was asking him about this a few years ago, his perspective was, well, I just don't work with corporations because they're so stuck in their ways. They're kind of that old mindset. Instead, I look at how can I help people in leadership positions of emerging startups become even more effective at what they're doing through plant medicine, because usually those folks are the ones who are open to it. Those who have something to lose, like in the corporate space, are not near as willing to make that happen. And yet we need the wisdom from plant medicine for business leaders of tomorrow. I think it's so critical.
Thank you for making that point. Because we need to find a way in there, and I'm glad you call it an existential crisis that we're facing. Not just in a physical existential crisis in terms of our mere existence, it's actually threatened, but also that a lot of the philosophical structures collapse, and we find ourselves asking what it means to be human in the face of AI, in the face of nauseating speed of change and development. So I think I absolutely agree. We do need leaders who are connected at those kind of levels. And I think psychedelics open the right kind of doors. So I'm glad we're having the conversation, and that you're bringing the conversation into the corporate space from commercial mindset, relating to people at eye level, from successful entrepreneur to another, and knowing what kind of stuff can open and release. Because if we don't establish sustainable, or if we run our businesses sustainable, they're just not going to sustain.
Precisely. Yeah. At this point, we're learning that more and more, that we have to look at things from a holistic perspective, and what better tool than psychedelics to wake us up to, again, this truth of interconnectedness. They help us to see how everything is interdependent. Yeah.
And leaders turn to coaches. They tend to not go to see a therapist, and exactly. I think this is where coaches can really open some doors, and the ones that work with psychedelics can open some very different doors.
Precisely.
Look, I'll skip the other questions that I have. The very last one I always ask is, and feel free to think about it for a minute. We have a few minutes left. If you could take over the screen of any person or group of people, including the whole world, could be one person, and you have their undivided attention for a minute, what would you tell them?
There's so many things, Yannick. I don't know what to choose. Okay, the thing that comes up for me is that so much of the work that we're doing with the psychedelics is almost to extinguish fear. And by that, I mean to enable more courage, more possibility, more creation, more expansion. And what is central to that process is an understanding of what lies on the other side of fear, which is love. And so I think so much of what we experience today with this, faltering of sense making and COVID-19 and it's fear is becoming more and more and more and more amplified. And I think if I could share one message, it's that when the dam breaks, and it will, that on that other side of fear is expansion, possibility, a sense of love, community, connection. And that exists now. It's just love is often the signal within the noise of fear. And I think it's incumbent upon each one of us to eliminate that noise, the noise of fear, and tune in as much as possible to the signal of love.
That's amazing. Great message. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I know you've got a busy schedule. Where can people find you or your work, the third wave synthesis? If people wanted to follow this up, where do they go?
So paulaustin.co is my personal website. And then thethirdwave.co is Third Waves. You can also find details on there about our coaching certification program /coaching-certification.
Along with a bunch of other really good resources, by the way. I love the questions of how to choose a coach.
We have a directory of vetted retreats and clinics and therapists and coaches. So pretty much anything you need for your journey to get going, we've created. And then if anyone has further questions, just to connect and reach out, there's a contact form on my personal website. And I welcome any thoughts, feedback, perspectives, questions from the podcast today.
Brilliant. Paul, again, thank you very much, and keep doing good work.
Thank you, Yannick.